Well, when I was thinking about what I could say here tonight, the first thing that occurred to me was to call a former student of mine, Ashley Lee Henderson, who is involved in numerous activist movements, among which are Black Lives Matter and the actions towards social justice in Chattanooga. And we actually ended up getting into a conversation that started with my asking her to, sort of describe specifically what it's like to be involved in these activities and so forth. But that turned into a conversation about thinking about how the present day Black freedom struggles have evolved out of different historical moments and different models for working for civil rights and social justice. So what I'm going to present tonight is sort of based on what we talked about, and then also draws on my own areas of expertise and that sort of thing. So I hope you find it helpful and useful to sort of start thinking about the contemporary means of activism and methods of activism in this more kind of historical light that takes into account, as Dr. Carter said, some of the issues of race relations and class issues and so forth. And I am going to read because I'm an academic and that's what we do, right? We read papers. So Langston Hughes, a stalwart figure of the Harlem Renaissance, or as it's also known, the new Negro Renaissance, an early 20th century manifestation of the Black American struggle for freedom, published his poem, I Too Sing America, in 1926. Many believe as a response to Walt Whitman's putatively all-encompassing catalog of the diverse individuals who make up the nation in his I Hear America Singing, from his Leaves of Grass, which he originally published in 1855 and then throughout his lifetime edited and republished up until 1881. So the version I think that Hughes was responding to was probably one of the later versions of that. Allison, can you hear now? Can you? You can sit up front. Come on.
Okay. No, I'm going to sit here.
Are you going to sit there? All right. I'll try to project.
Thank you.
Okay. Hughes notes, however, that Whitman leaves out a significant element of his social reality. Here is his poem. I, too, sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Then, besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. Hughes' declaration of his intention to claim a seat at the table someday captures exquisitely the tenor of his era's approach to the quest for civic and legal equality. In the Harlem Renaissance version of the civil rights movement, modernist, talented writers, artists, and intellectuals sought to provide proof of African-American artistic and intellectual capacity that would translate into social equality and the consequent dismantling of Jim Crow segregation and discrimination. And their efforts were marked by mainstream recognition of their work. The year 1924 marked publication for the first time of a Negro novel, Jessie Fawcett's There Is Confusion, by a major white New York publishing house, Bonnie and Live Right, which fired the hopes of a generation of, quote, new Negroes, that they might claim the authority to represent themselves and their own experience with little white mediation. During the decade spanning roughly 1924 to 1935, an immense outpouring of artistic and intellectual work was produced, intended to put to rest the stereotypical image of the darky of the past, who would be replaced by modern, articulate, sophisticated, and complex Black individuals in the American imagination. Much of the early work of the period represented the values and experience of that talented tenth. Upwardly mobile professionals and members of the intelligentsia dominated by middle-class values and resources, and expressed their goal of integration and access to social, educational, and political structures through demonstration of their humanity and modernity. To be sure, a continuation of previous centuries characterized by the effort to demonstrate black humanity through the act of writing, as Henry Louis Gates documents, but coupled with a new frankness about race. The Negro question that had been analyzed since the mid-19th century by figures such as John Stuart Mill was put aside as the outdated stuff of white authority, and repudiation of and resistance to the double consciousness described by W.E.B. Du Bois as early as 1903, that desire to see oneself clearly, which is always hampered by the necessity of considering how white Americans see black Americans and how that must dictate one's sense of identity and one's actions, served as a foundation for the overt goal of integration and new forms of activism spilling over into popular culture. The urban New Negroes and many avant-garde urban whites flouted Jim Crow convention in the form of passing or otherwise flirting with social desegregation in the form of white slumming at Harlem cabarets, integrated private parties, and sometimes intimate relationships between blacks and whites. Many whites were eager to serve as allies as well, but in the form usually of literary patronage. Carl Van Vechten, for example, befriended and from time to time helped financially support numerous New Negro artists and writers, and also conducted his own extensive research into African American culture and history in an attempt to present a more accurate representation of black Americans through his novel Nigger Heaven, an account of life in Harlem. And I actually had the opportunity a few months ago to go to the archives at Yale University where the James Weldon Johnson collection is housed and look at some of Van Vechten's materials. It was really fascinating. While Mrs. Charlotte Osgood Mason served as a monetary patron to writers such as Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. In addition to their endeavors in arts and letters, the elite, sophisticated, and often highly educated New Negroes put their abilities to work toward activism in the form of letter-writing campaigns and fundraisers for entities like the NAACP, a prominent organization, still prominent, that focused on litigation strategies to work for reform of discriminatory laws through political networking and influence. As the era wore on, an increasing debate developed about the influence and importance of what were referred to as the folk, the black working class, largely rural population, their importance to African American culture and its members' prospects, particularly once the Great Depression began. Into the 1930s, many of the Harlem Renaissance figures took a more radical turn, becoming involved in the Communist Party out of hope for social and economic equality, through the Communist Party's perspective on the universality of the workers' plight and its incorporation of internationalism, the recognition of worldwide struggle against capitalism and oppression. Hughes, Arna Bontemps, and others turned to overt socialist critique and cast increasing focus on the plight of the rural Southern Negro. And Du Bois identified what he called the blind spot that white Americans possessed about black contributions to democracy and American affluence in his book Black Reconstruction, which was published in 1935. That laid the groundwork for the concept of white privilege that was revisited later by activists and scholars in the 1960s and later, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. These are Du Bois's words. The emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the Emancipation of Labor was the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black. Du Bois also advanced his interest in Pan-Africanism, the linkage of oppressed peoples of color throughout the world in a common struggle, influenced in part by popular front ideas advanced by the Communist Party at the time. Hence, the Harlem Renaissance arguably helped lay the groundwork for the mid-century civil rights movement work, and its continuing focus on access to social, legal, and political institutions through its appeal to middle-class respectability, if not through its radical politics, and we'll also talk a little bit more about that in a minute. For the civil rights movement took the new Negro's forthright, if still primarily discursive, challenge to discriminatory social structures and practices a step further, with its emphasis upon direct action and nonviolent physical resistance, and its formation of a movement to gain social, economic, and political access that would improve the living conditions of Black Americans, disenfranchised from the full citizenship that liberty of property and voting rights are said to accord. Martin Luther King, of course, as a primary figure of the civil rights movement, continued the tradition of alliance with white supporters, on one hand, primarily white clergymen and politicians, as you know, to bring about activation of the legal and legislative guarantees that were gained in the era. Of course, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Through social movements designed to put pressure on society and government to make good on the promises and to extend them to all areas of social and political life. This time, the front line of resistance, however, was the folk themselves, in the form of disenfranchised Black Southerners who would march in the streets in their best Sunday clothes to demonstrate their amalgamation of social respectability and a forthright defiance against Jim Crow customs that still prevail. Did anybody here participate in any marches in that era? Okay. I did a presentation to another group about a year ago, and I was surprised by the number of people in the audience that actually had done some marching. So it was really exciting to get to talk to them. King recognized the importance of local action and theorized that the nonviolent resistance tactics, of course, used by Gandhi for Indian autonomy could be effective in this case as well. And moreover, he emphasized empowering those most directly affected by segregation and discrimination to produce their own destiny. New elements of this later 20th century manifestation of overt resistance included, of course, the Christian church as a locus of organizing, a relatively safe space for gathering and for planning away from white domination, which many have pointed to as a continuation of tactics, of course, developed during the era of slavery. It was a platform for disseminating the message of idealism and redemption for humanity, translated in this case into passive resistance and direct action protest strategies like Montgomery and Birmingham, and an incubator for the creation of new organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which kept the focus on integration and often worked in primarily urban areas. Newly affluent college students, mostly Black, a few white, radicalized by their education and by their witness of the treatment of non-white colonialized peoples in media coverage of the Vietnam War, which of course was escalating at the same point, were motivated to challenge the status quo. This led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which featured student leadership and grounded itself in rural areas, focused more on organizing for access to civic structures, like voting and political party participation, again through demonstration and protest. King's emphasis on civil disobedience, which he explained famously in Letter from a Birmingham Jail as the actions of, quote, one who breaks an unjust law and who must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. He continues, I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. This arguably is an extension and expansion of the civil disobedience of his Harlem Renaissance forebears, expanded by means of careful analysis of philosophical and historical precepts that both justify individual acts of civil disobedience in service of a higher right or good, and point to a more sophisticated understanding of the systemic inequality and racism that produce the local effects of generalized poverty characterized by under or unemployment, lack of access to effective education, substandard housing, and the psychic hopelessness faced by a historic and seemingly permanent black underclass. While the SCLC and SNCC represented increasingly disparate poles of understanding about how the civil rights movement should proceed, the two organizations did collaborate, there we go, most noticeably for the march from Selma to Montgomery, which finally went off despite several initially aborted attempts caused by local court and police obstruction. Disagreement over how to strategize around the obstructions compounded by the murder of a white Northern clergyman in some ways marked the end of this phase of the civil rights movement. And I would contend that it did so in at least two ways. First of all, passage of the Voting Rights Act was perceived to be precipitated by the event, producing a need to consider what the next move should be, particularly since there was a growing popular perception that complete legislative victory had been achieved. Therefore, we're done, right? And my guess is that was something whites were more probably finding compelling than others, right? Also, white support for and participation in direct action diminished drastically at this point, possibly in part because of the murder of the clergyman, and again, probably also partly because of that sense that something had ended, something was finished, right? It's here that the more radical element, and I want to look at the term radical for just a minute. What is the root of that word? I'm going to put my students on the spot here, essentially. What's the root of the word radical?
Yeah, I know we talked about this.
Okay, she remembers we talked about it, which is good. Okay. The Latin word radix, right, means root. And this is where the term radical comes from, right? So I want to put out there that radical often gets taken in a kind of very negative connotation. But what it really means is literally getting to the root of the issue, right? And it's this kind of turn partly in the civil rights movement that I think we're seeing at this point. So the more radical element in the sense of getting to the root of things becomes more overtly operative here. Like the new Negroes of the early 20th century, many young black men and women and a very few white allies in the late 1960s refocused their attention on those individuals still most in need. We're not talking about grand social structures anymore or legislative structures or anything like that, but we're talking about what are the practical approaches that are going to address the needs of the people for whom very little has changed at this point. Despite the legislative and legal decisions that purportedly represented progress in the socio-political arena, there were still high numbers of poor urban and rural blacks effectively still disenfranchised in very real terms. White attention to the movement, both from the mainstream media and from those former allies, again, had waned considerably after 1965. And many conventional accounts of King's life and of civil rights history itself effectively sort of believe those years, from 1965 to 68. Yet it's this period that arguably helped set the stage for today's new Black freedom struggle in a variety of ways. First of all, King, along with his often adversaries in the burgeoning Black Power movement, shifted focus more precisely toward the structural features of American society and government that actively produce its racially marked underclass. Black Power movement activists, in addition, developed pragmatic programs. You're probably all familiar with the breakfast programs, the education programs, all of those pragmatic means of trying to just make life more bearable, provide those basic needs, designed to alleviate specific effects of structural inequality, were instituted at the same time that they fostered Black autonomy and self-determination from a nationalist perspective. And of course, there's another parallel in some ways to the Harlem Renaissance here as well. A large part of the Black Power movement hinged on the Black arts movement. Community theaters, Mary Baraka, of course, is probably the most familiar figure of that. Also, as part of his Poor People's Campaign, King himself developed an economic perspective that broadened his concerns to include those from across racial and ethnic lines living below the poverty line. As Jeff Cohen and Norman Solomon note, King, quote, called for radical changes in the structure of our society, those are King's words, to redistribute wealth and power. True compassion, King declared, is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Like King and his Black Power movement counterparts, today's Black freedom struggle focuses on immediate need. Some sources report that a Black man is killed every 28 minutes in the United States. And I never can say this word, a statistic substantiated by frightening and seemingly endless accounts in the media of yet another by police or vigilante gunfire. As contemporary activist Ashley Wood Henderson puts it, Ferguson is not a new phenomenon for Black people in the United States. It's not something that just suddenly happened, suddenly came out of nowhere. It means people have had enough. At the same time, though, like Hughes and King, contemporary activists are open to creating lines of coalition. Ashley continues, nobody fighting for liberation would ever say they didn't agree that all lives matter. But Black communities are right now, and for a long time back, have been disproportionately affected by violence, low-wage jobs, and what is often these days referred to as the new Jim Crow mass incarceration. This doesn't mean that others don't deserve self-determination, but material conditions mean this needs to be lifted up by us now. Other groups should be able to lift up their oppression too, and we can work together, but it's critical right now to focus on Black lives if we are to continue to exist in this country. Our white allies and non-Black people of color are recognizing it now. It's not happening on this scale to any other marginalized group in this country. At the same time, Ashley notes, it's time once again to acknowledge that the primary issue no longer is access. It's self-determination, the right to govern our own way. As part of the effort to identify and dismantle the structures of inequality that produce both socioeconomic inequality and distress and their attendant conditions of poverty and violence, activists since the 60s have illuminated the role of white privilege in sustaining and perpetuating the oppression of particularly the poor and the people of color who overwhelmingly constitute that group. Socialists Ted Allen and Noah Ignatin, developing the concept out of Du Bois's observation about the white blind spot, noted the necessity of white workers' quote, repudiation of white skin privilege. As Allen described it, what we are talking about is not the Negro question, not, for instance, the history of the Negro and his struggle for equal rights, but the white question, the centrality of the problem of white supremacy and the white skin privilege, which historically frustrated the struggle for democracy, progress, and socialism in the U.S. He wrote that in 1965. This radical concept moved into the mainstream academy in later years. As defined by Peggy McIntosh in 1988, white privilege is, quote, an invisible package of unearned assets, an invisible weightless backpack of special provisions that white persons can, quote, count on cashing in each day, but about which we were meant to remain oblivious. Awareness of white privilege means that for white people, quote, in facing it, we must give up the myth of meritocracy. If these things are true, it is not such a free country. One's life is not one makes it. Many doors open for certain people through no virtue of their own. This unearned advantage provides conferred dominance because it's a product of the structure of the social system. However, McIntosh notes, disapproving of the systems won't be enough to change them. I was taught to think that racism could end if white individuals changed their attitudes. But a white skin in the U.S. opens many doors for whites, whether or not we approve of the way dominance has been conferred on us. Individual acts can palliate, but cannot end these problems. The silences and denials surrounding privilege are the key political tool here. They keep the thinking about equality or equity incomplete, protecting unearned advantage and conferred dominance by making these taboo subjects. In a recent New Yorker interview, McIntosh decried the flippant use of the phrase, check your privilege, which some of you may have encountered on Facebook or elsewhere, to remind individuals who identify as white of the need to acknowledge their structural advantage over other members of society. Because, she says, such usage tends to foster hostility and defensiveness rather than productive dialogue about how we all are implicated in the social system. But she did add, everybody has a combination of unearned advantage and unearned disadvantage in life. Whiteness is just one of the many variables one can look at. The key thing is to let people testify to their own experience. Then they'll stop fighting with each other. It has to do with working on your inner history to understand that you were in systems and that they are in you. Seeing the oppression of others is, of course, very important work, but so is seeing how the systems oppress oneself. This conscious awareness of the intersectionality of advantage and disadvantage is a key element of contemporary Black freedom struggles. As Ashley notes, those involved in activism within movements like Black Lives Matter constitute a spectrum of situated individuals who must respect one another and find ways to share power. Quote, one person can't be canonized. All are leading the movement. The new Black Power movement is not just upper middle class educated men. Liberation is not going to come from a black guy in a suit. Sorry, Daryl. These are the people the power elite will have to talk to. Street dudes, somebody from the hood who's inspired by the elders but is not them. They will also have to come to terms with Black women, with gay, and with trans leadership as well. So, this is kind of the last thing Ashley and I talked about. As a white, middle-class, highly educated woman, I'm obligated to query, what does it mean to be an ally of Black freedom movements as a means of helping promote social justice and equity? It's not as civil rights activists in the 20s or the 60s reminded us by means of whites co-opting the activism of black individuals and imposing our own leadership narratives and motives by way of authorizing the freedom movement, even by simply bankrolling them. For that retains power and autonomy within the white arena and sends the message that activists serve at the pleasure of white supporters. Nor is it, as Jessica Valenti notes, by means of performing awareness through white guilt tweets like those under the hashtag of criming while white, which compile accounts of white persons' ability to commit petty transgressions and even crimes without fear of violent recourse from authorities. As Valenti observes, public performance of guilt over your privilege doesn't stop racism from hurting people. Only keeping the focus on changing the system and working for a dismantling of the power obtained through that privilege do. What Valenti doesn't address, though, is what white allies can do in service of that dismantling without taking over the show. So here's what I think, for what it's worth. What I can do is be a presence in which it's safe for those engaged in struggle to express their authentic experience and know that it will be believed rather than dismissed as rhetoric designed to gain an unfair advantage. What I can do is listen to the wisdom gained by those who have had that experience and allow myself to be led in their path as I work to help them produce justice within our community. What I can do is offer the services of my knowledge, my compassion, and my love as I, quote, join with, not take over. As Janie Woods puts it, people of color cannot and should not shoulder the burden of dismantling the racist white supremacist system that devalues and criminalizes black life without the all-in support, blood, sweat, and tears of white people. But that support must be just that. I must take the supporting role, not the lead, and I must be the character represented in the story, not the writer herself. And perhaps that's the greatest message to us of the Harlem Renaissance.
Thank you. Well done.